Hi, everyone. This is Laura Womack of Never Too Late Cafe with Bloom Where You're Planted podcast. And I have a special guest with me today, and I'm going to let him introduce himself and tell you where he's from.
Hi, I'm Arlan Andrews and currently living near Louisville, Kentucky.
Welcome. So tell us what some of your, I know you're a writer, and
Yes.
tell us a little about your genre of writing.
Primarily, I write science fiction, but I also have excursions into ancient civilizations, paranormal, UFOs, and all kind of weird stuff. It all fits together. To me, it's all part of one thing.
I know you've lived many different places. So can you kind of fill us in on the different places that you've lived and maybe how your work and where you've lived has kind of contributed to your writings?
Sure. I was born and raised in rural Arkansas outside of Little Rock. I moved to New Mexico as soon as I could at age 18 to work at White Sands Missile Range as a co-op student. And I got to see thousands of missiles launched over the years. And I earned degrees, got married, had kids. Worked with Bell Labs, the U.S. government, various other companies I started. As a person interested in engineering, technology, science fiction, and spaceships and rockets and all that, I always found humor and sometimes disgust in the things that I observed. So I wrote about them. Short stories, humorous stories, typically about engineers screw up or scientists don't do things right. And I always have a place in my heart to despise politicians. So that gives me a lot of grist for the mill.
Is there one place in particular that influenced you as far as you wanting to be a science fiction writer?
Well, it wasn't the location so much as the fact that I started reading science fiction at age 9. I was a little barefoot kid, true story, barefoot kid, a dirt road in Arkansas, and a bookmobile comes by, and my cousin gives me a book called Red Planet by Robert Heinlein. And I read it one afternoon under a tree, and I said, this is pretty good. Is there anything more like this? That changed my entire life. So I think Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, these were, and H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, all these people influenced me to want to go do something other than be a barefoot kid in Arkansas.
I see. I have one of your books that I got last year, earlier in the year, I should say. And it's a collection of short stories, very interesting, I might say. I can say that I'm not normally a science fiction reader, so I opted to go with the short story collection first. And it's very interesting. I mean, it's sort of like giving an inside peek on some of the world of, the missiles and the technology and sort of a combination of sci-fi and engineering. One of the things that it talked about, it's in nanotechnology. Can you explain kind of what that means?
Okay, nanotechnology was conceptually invented by Dr. Richard Feynman many years ago in the 1960s. He said, what if we were able to take atoms and move them around and build them as parts of machines and build machines the size of molecules? He wrote an article called There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom. He said, there's no reason we can't take atoms and build up. Today, in all manufacturing today, typically it's machining. You have to take a big chunk of steel and cut it down to what you want and put pieces together. He says, what if you started with atoms and molecules and just stack them, build them up into machines? And a guy named Eric Drexler, I interviewed him when I worked at the White House Science Office and had him talk about it. He wrote a book called The Engines of Creation, in which by assembling things at the molecular and atomic level, we would be duplicating what nature does. We're built up. We are constructions ourselves. Everything about us is constructed of atoms and molecules. So what if we could do the same thing? You don't waste any parts. I gave a talk to engineers about this many years ago, saying all the parts are standard size. There's no tolerance. Every hydrogen atom, every carbon atom is exactly the same. So you put them together in some fashion and build little machines. You can imagine making machines, hopefully good machines, maybe little robots that go inside your body and can't clean out cancer cells or cholesterol and that sort of stuff. And we're actually getting there. I wrote about it. The first government endorsement of that was in a chapter I wrote for a White House science thing for Congress back in 1993, in which I said, I copied on what Drexler said, that we would take these machines and molecules and build small machines. And we called it, now they call it additive manufacturing. You put things together. You don't take things apart. You know, if you're going to have a wood lathe, you carve it out and you make furniture. What if you just were able to take molecules and build up something out of wood, make it out of wood, any size you wanted, very fast, no wasted parts, totally recyclable. That's what it is. Nanotechnology, we're getting there. It's not exactly what Drexler and I talked about 30 years ago, but they are getting there. Tiny and tiny and tiny. This is, you think about micro machines. You've seen pictures of small robots. Well, these things are 1,000 times smaller, maybe 1,000,000 times smaller. So it's going to be a whole new technology.
Reminds me of Jules Verne's stories, you know, where wasn't Jules Verne that had the little thing that goes in the body and
that was
the arteries.
Isaac Asimov wrote about that, and there was a movie about it too. But a lot of people talked about that, and we're at that stage now. It's actually happening on a larger scale right now.
Wow. I did look up and, you know, kind of did a little research on it. I know that it's currently being used for food packaging because those can detect salmonella in food and, you know, things that we're not aware of. But anyway, so it's so you have a futuristic theme and space related and research and other scientific projects. So I know you've authored some books and there's a collection of poems and essays. Is there any special one of your books that you think is more special, something that you've created that is your favorite?
That's like asking you to pick out your favorite child, you know, the children of the brain.
Yeah.
Actually, I've got another one that's not out yet. That's with Hydra Publications. It's going to be coming out soon, called Paradox Lost. Paradox Lost is a time travel machine, very time machine story, very complicated, backwards and forwards and sideways in time and all kind of weird stuff. But the one that's out right now that I like best, actually, is called Valley of the Shaman, and it takes place in a valley in New Mexico that I was actually at, and reproduces a few of the experiences I had, but most of it's fiction. And it talks about parallel universes and alternate histories and things like that. But it takes place in the Jemez Valley, northwest of Albuquerque. And that's one of my favorite places in the world.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I recall you have lived many, many places. So that is one of your favorites. So, how long have you known you wanted to be a scientist or an engineer? I don't know exactly what title to give you. You're both.
No, I'm actually an engineer. I have 3 degrees, and they're all in engineering.
Oh, okay.
I think from the time I read that first book, Red Planet, back in 1950, that afternoon, I knew I wanted to do something to do with space. So I went to work at White Sands Missile Range as a co-op student. We worked 6 months of the year and went to school 6 months of the year. And my first job really was tracking missiles. That's pretty cool when you're 18 years old to be operating a telescope and tracking missiles, and even later on satellites, when satellites started. Watch the rockets out there, be around people who do that for a living. It was fascinating. I knew I wanted to be something. I didn't want to be a scientist. I didn't want to do research. I wanted to build things. And so I got into engineering, and I worked on anti-ballistic missiles. I worked on nuclear weapons. I worked on home consumer products. Started a few companies. Engineering allows you to expand yourself and be very creative. And I was always more creative than I was technical. my earlier tests I took for, when you take those tests in high school for merit scholarships and stuff. On my, it was funny, on my writing and vocabulary and that stuff, I scored it in like 98%. On the math, I didn't do that well. And it's funny that my career turned out to be something to do more with math than the writing.
Interesting.
I mentioned a friend of ours, mutual friend and relative here, Lee Pennington.
Yeah.
He's a little bit older than me, but he said when he took those tests, he scored very high on the math and very low on the written vocabulary stuff. Yet his entire career has been on the writing side.
Yeah.
So he and I scored differently, and we wound up with different careers. It was kind of funny.
Yeah. I actually spoke to him not long ago. So when did you know that you wanted to be a writer instead of just...
I don't know. About age 6 or 7, I think. My parents and grandparents used to tell stories, and I would try to write down stories. But as far as becoming a professional writer, I didn't sell anything until I was, in my 30s. I never realized you could make a living at writing. And of course, it's very difficult. You have to treat it like any other profession. You have to go in at 40, 60, 80 hours a week until you learn how to do it. And all the stuff I've written would not make a living for me. My living came from being an engineer. But my sanity, what I have left of it, came from writing. I can express myself in writing. I can take out my frustrations, my problems, my disappointments, my triumphs, everything else. I can put in writing, and it discharges it and takes care of it. I don't think about it anymore. Along the way, in my 30s, I started to meet science fiction writers, and you realize that they were real people I had admired and everything. I always thought they were gods or something, but no, they were real people. Some of them were kind of the other end of the spectrum. But anyway, I realized they can do it. I can do it. And I had encouragement from people like that. In the science fiction field, unlike other genres, I understand, you're welcome. If you want to write, you're welcome. People will help you. They'll give you a hand up or suggestions, contacts, editors, all that sort of thing. It's a good fraternity for the most part.
So you had a supportive environment. So that's wonderful. So I saw on something about your Sigma, the think tank, the science fiction think tank. Can you describe how that got started? Yeah.
I was a White House fellow in the White House Science Office back in 1991, 92. And as a low-ranking person on a totem pole, I got sent to all the meetings that the bosses didn't want to go to. There were perks to that because there were a lot of drinks and a lot of free food. But I went to these forecasting meetings, and I listened to, the head of the National Science Foundation poo-pooed nanotechnology. He poo-pooed virtual reality and actually laughed at people that I admired who proposed these things. And I was infuriated. So I went back to my office and sat down and wrote a manifesto. The future is too important to be left to futurists. And the guy sitting next to me said, "What are you doing, Arlan?" And he happened to be Lieutenant Colonel Doug Beeson, who was also from Albuquerque and a science fiction writer. And I said, "Well, join up." So he joined. And pretty soon in a week, I had about 10 people who wanted to help. I said, "We want to provide science fiction futurism to the federal government." Because in those forecasting meetings I went to, they had bureaucrats, government bureaucrats, and a few industry bureaucrats. They weren't very imaginative. And I told them, I said, "My gosh, I've heard better futurism at a science fiction convention over a few beers in a back room than I ever heard from all these highly paid government people who are trying to forecast the future." And they were horrible at it. And it's not that science fiction people predict the future. We predict all kind of futures. It's like somebody said, it's like a duck hunter and a shotgun. You shoot up 1,000 pellets, and something will hit. And oh boy, look what I did. I killed a duck. Well, no, you were lucky. You might be good, but you were lucky. So we didn't try to predict futures, but the typical science fiction story is set in a future. And when you put a character in a future, that character is kind of look around and see what's going on. Well, are there spaceships or flying cars? No. Is it atomic desolation? Well, maybe. Is it computers? Oh, no. Just whatever the story calls for, you have to create a future around that to make it believable for the reader to enjoy. And so that's what all science fiction writers do.
So it looked like some of your members might have been in the gaming community. How does that figure in?
Well, it's creative. One of them is Marco Green. He was the guy who wrote the narration part of a very famous game called Fallout. Called Fallout. I think it's Fallout. I don't do the games, but he creates too. He has futuristic scenarios. He puts characters in them. A few years ago, 9 years ago, a group of us went to Saudi Arabia to give a panel on science fiction to Saudis. And as soon as they found out that Mark had been involved in this game Fallout, he was a rock star. Literally, all these Arab guys mobbed him and took him away. I couldn't go because no women were allowed to go to these things. And I had 2 women members and I wasn't going to leave them. So he comes back the next day. I said, "Where'd you go?" He said, "Oh my gosh, the king's grandson." Of course, the king had 50 grandsons, but the king's grandson had me over. They're all gamers. And the last words they said to us before we left, they said, "Arlan, next time you come over here, forget all this science fiction stuff. We're going to do gaming. We'll rent an entire theater. We'll have Mark just do gaming stuff for us." So there's a multi-billion-dollar industry out there in gaming. And with the virtual reality world, the metaverse is coming up very soon. It's probably going to be $1 trillion business. So
wow, who would have known? Who would have known?
It's going to be.
So there was a term I saw in one of the writings called disruptive technologies. Can you explain what that term means?
Disruptive technology. Well, that was one of the presentations that we gave in Saudi Arabia. We were at the Global Competitiveness Forum in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, January of 2012, almost 10 years ago. And they wanted to know about disruptive technologies. That's something that comes in and blows away all old technologies. That would be something like when the transistor came in a long time ago. The vacuum tube industry died.
Oh.
When Jeff Bezos decided to do retail, to take advantage of the internet and do retail sales on the internet, that destroyed Sears, and Penny's, and most of the other big ones. They were destroyed. It was a disruptive technology. The internet is a disruptive technology. It allows people to do things in a better way, in a cheaper and faster way than before, more convenient. I mean, my wife just contacted me a minute ago. I got 2 more Amazon packages today. In the old days, I would have had to go out to a car parts store and find these things and go over town. Now I got them in 30 seconds. I ordered 2 parts I needed, and the next day they came in. That's disruptive. A disruptive technology that's going on right now would be what Elon Musk is doing with SpaceX. He's got reusable rockets. In the old days, rockets were built around like artillery was. The Saturn V's and all those threw away everything except a little piece at the top with the people in it. Imagine, I was an interview on television 25 years ago about this. Imagine what it would cost if you're going to fly 747 from Los Angeles to Sydney, Australia. And when you got there, you had thrown away everything except the cockpit. It would cost hundreds of millions of dollars per flight. Well, that's the way spaceships were built, like rockets, to throw away everything except a little piece.
Right.
Now he's got reusable spaceships, mostly reusable, not completely, but mostly reusable. And he's going to have the price of getting into space is going to be 1/100th of what it is now. In fact, he's already putting other people out of business. His reusable rockets have been reused, some of them dozens of times. And in the old days, they would be thrown away. Today, NASA is building a rocket called the SLS, the Space Launch System. is going to cost $2 to $4 billion every time it's launched to the moon. Whereas Musk, with his reusable rockets, is talking about doing that for like 1/10, maybe 1/20th as much.
Wow.
That's disruptive.
So you stay up on technology, I can tell.
Well, not as much as I did. A lot of my time now is spent writing, and I like to read a lot. I wish I'd had a liberal arts education along the way. I've always admired or envied people who got to immerse themselves in college, humanities, literature, and things like that. I took those courses that I could because they were easy and fun and a break. The engineering courses I took, science and math, were not easy.
Right.
And it was a break for me to take world literature or psychology or political science or sociology. I loved those things. Couldn't make a living at it, I knew. I made a living as an engineer, but my heart's always been on the writing, romantic side. Engineering itself can be extremely tough and not a lot of fun sometimes. When you're successful, it's fun. When you watch your rocket take off or your other things work, it's fun. But to me, the romance of engineering, the romance of space travel is a lot more interesting, a lot more fun than the actual performance of it.
Well, with your Sigma, and you can be on a consultative basis for the government, has anything ever been predicted that you can share?
Okay, over the years, the way Sigma's works is this. There are about 40 science fiction writers in the group. You can find them on our website, sigmaforum.org. They're all listed. Somebody comes to us, or I find somebody, or somebody finds an opportunity for us to help consult with the government. I put that idea out on private email to everybody. Say, anybody want to help? Anybody want to work? Whoever responds then gets involved. And we do different things. We can write reports for them. We can write, actually, in some cases, stories for them based on what they're interested in. We can have, in the old days, before all this pandemic stuff hit, we had meetings with them, face-to-face meetings and panels and presentations and all that sort of thing. A few of the things that we talked about 10, 12 years ago have come about. I've always asked all these government people, and we've met with everybody, all the different armed forces and intelligence agencies with all the alphabet numbers and alphabets and stuff like that, 3-letter alphabet agencies. Can you tell us what impact this has had? And the typical response we get is, well, you've changed our way of thinking. We can't tell you what you did that did that, but you've changed our way of thinking. One of the things I did do back in 2009, when the Arab Spring thing was just starting, at a meeting with a bunch of those 3-letter agencies, I held up iPhone. I said, this right here is going to be your instrument of revolution in the future. You're going to have revolutions at the speed of text. And they laughed at that, but I said, think about it. When you have these people in these horrible societies that are oppressed by their leaders and they have a way to communicate with each other, you're going to have massive revolutions. I thought it would be China first. I didn't know it was going to be the Arabs. But that was something that actually was before the Arab Spring hit, because, and people I talked about, I wasn't the one that came up with that idea. Other people talked about that before, that once you allow ordinary people to communicate with each other and they get the real story about things, they're not going to believe what their governments tell them. That even happens over here.
Right. So
a few things. There have been, I won't go into a couple of specific things that our people talked about other than my text revolution. A couple of specific things that did happen that we did talk about. Well, I'll tell you one of them. One of them was our friend Marco Green, the gamer, at a meeting. I wasn't there, but at a meeting with the West Point people in 2008, 2009, he talked about the fact that in the future in warfare, there's going to be small drones, the size of your hand or smaller, maybe the size of bugs. and these would attack in swarms. Some would be reconnaissance, and some would have explosives on them or other kind of payloads. These things in the future would be very, very important. It would be a whole new way of warfare with drone warfare instead of people, tanks, and airplanes. Well, that has happened now since then. Now, I can't say, and he can't say that, and nobody will tell us, yeah, you thought of it first. But along the way, somebody did, and we predicted those. A thing I did in 2016, I stood in front of the Joint Special Operations Command down in Tampa, Florida. And I said, how many of you people in here have been around this business for 25 years? About half of them held up their hands. They were colonels and majors and stuff like that there. I said, how many of you ever imagined that 25 years later, that some kid that hadn't even been born at 25 years ago would be shedding tears over a small robot in a horrible place like Afghanistan? And this has actually happened because these people had these little robots that went out and looked for IEDs along the way. And occasionally they would get blown up. And they said occasionally the troops had been so attached to that little robot, they gave it names and everything else, that they shed tears when the thing's blown up. And I said, that's what science fiction does for you. Because 50 years ago, science fiction people were talking about people having relations with robots and caring about them and vice versa. I said, what I want you people to do in here today is think about that young girl who's just born, maybe girl just born yesterday. You don't want her 25 years from now being in another hole, sand hole, whatever, in another part of the world, doing something, being upset, or even having to fight. So you think about that kid that just got born. What can you do to prevent her from having to be fighting in another place 25 years from now?
Right.
I said, that's what science fiction thinking is. Just put yourself in that place 25 years from now. How do we not get here? If you're in a horrible place, how do we back off and stop that from happening?
Well, this podcast is called Bloom Where You're Planted. And I always ask what that means to you.
Well, it's like the characters in these stories, look around, figure out where you are, why you're there, what's the situation. Is there an imminent threat? Is there an imminent opportunity? No matter where you are, there you are. I mean, I've lived in 10 different states over the years because my engineering job has taken me all around the United States, and actually for a while in Hong Kong, right before, 6 months before the massacre at Tiananmen Square, where my son happened to be in town in Beijing at that time. But wherever you are, there you are. Make the best of it. There's always opportunities. If you're going to be a writer and you're put in a new environment, that's a fantastic opportunity, because the opportunity is, how do you respond to something totally new? How do you respond to something that's really, really nice or something that's a threat? And that's where writing comes from. It has to come from inside the person. That's what it means to me. What's
next for Arlan Andrews?
All right. Well, I spent a lot of time. Okay, first off, in 2012 and 2017, I made trips to Peru. I went down to look at one particular site, but I found another one that was much more interesting, a place called Quirumiac. It happens to be a solar calendar that's carved into a huge stone in Peru. And as soon as I looked at it, I knew it was a solar calendar, even though it's never been identified, and the conventional archaeologists have never even looked at it very much. They just look at it and say, yeah, it's shaped like the moon, like a stone rainbow. So it's got to be lunar, and it's got to be feminine. It's got to be a worship place. And as an engineer, I looked at it. Wait a minute. People don't go to that much trouble unless they're going to use it for something. Yeah, maybe it is ritual, but part of it is going to be practical. Why would you make it look like a solar calendar if it's not? So I went down again in 2017 with my brother and took a lot of pictures. Anyhow, long story short, Tony Acree now of Hydra Publications has the manuscript. It's called Quirumiac, Lost Secrets of the Shadow Machine. The shadows on this device, on this carving, will tell you the day of the year, the solstices, the equinoxes, everything else, just by shadows. And as far as I was able to determine, it's a unique sculpture in the entire world in all of history. There's never been anything like it before. We don't know who did it, don't know when, but it still works. Even it can be at least 500 years old. It might be thousands of years old, and it still works. So there's a book called Lost Secrets of the Shadow Machine that's coming out. He's got the other book coming out called Paradox Lost, I've already mentioned. Then I've got a trilogy, far future trilogy coming out from Baen Books. It's going to be e-format only, called Thaw. This takes place 30,000 years from now, after the next ice age has begun to thaw out, and all the massive changes that happened around the world because of that. And it's part of that is already published in Analog Magazine years ago and was nominated for a Hugo Award a few years ago, but it didn't get anything. But so that I got a trilogy coming out, fiction book from Hydra and a nonfiction book from Hydra about Kia Romiak. And hopefully all those will be out in the next few months. And I've got a couple of other ones I'm writing. These things come in, you can't stop them. Not only that, but if the trilogy does all right, even if it doesn't, the little guys, I've got some little guys that are 2 feet tall that are heroes, protagonists in the Thaw books. They're demanding that their stories. They keep telling me our story ain't over yet. You got to get it there and write the rest of it. Oh God, give me a break. It's amazing how it works. At one time, in the first book I did, this is what I've been doing during the pandemic last year and this year. In the first book I did, one of the main characters gets murdered. I didn't see it coming. I watched the story and I write what I see, and the guy gets murdered, and I had tears. Wait a minute. I thought he was going to do something else, and he was killed.
And it was your story.
It was my own story, but no, it was his story. They did it. I just try to describe what I see. But that's how writers get involved with what they're doing. It's a whole new world out there.
Amazing. I've always wondered the process, and I'm sure it's as unique as an individual that writes. My friend and science fiction writer, the late Dr. Jerry Purnell, said that anybody can be a writer if you have average intelligence, average command of the language you're writing in our case, English, and hopefully you have access to a keyboard and a computer and word processor, so you can to read is to rewrite. Basically, you sit down with stream of consciousness, write whatever comes to mind. Doesn't make any difference. How you feel, what it looks like, what the weather is, what the news was, anything. Just keep writing, page after page after page after page after page. And at some point, it might be first page, it might be 1,000 pages, but eventually, somewhere in there, you will find your own voice and your own style. Now, it helps if you want to write in a genre or a particular area to be well read in that. Read, if you're going to do Westerns, read the best Westerns. If you're going to do science fiction or romance or horror or whatever else, nonfiction, read that. You can get a feel for what other people have done and what works. But at some point, you have to do it yourself. There's nothing more intimidating than that white screen waiting for you to put something down. And the computer makes no mistakes. Only you make mistakes. But write those pages. Write 100 pages. Eventually, your voice will come through. Your style will come through. And in these days of Amazon and everything else, getting published is not a big deal anymore. Selling a lot is a big deal, but there are ways to do that too. But the main thing is to write. If you want to be a writer, you have to write. And if somebody says, "Oh, I'm a writer," or somebody says, "Well, have you published?" If they say no, I'll say, "Well, I don't think you're quite a writer yet. You have to publish something, get it out there for other people to feedback on." That's the important thing. Now, I have friends who became millionaires by writing the right thing at the right time. I have had others who have struggled their entire career, never made anything. Fortunately, I've never had to depend on my income from writing to pay the bills, because that wouldn't have worked. But if you want to be a writer, write. That's all I can say. That's good advice and wonderful words of wisdom from those individuals out there that's their preference is to be a writer. Well, our time is about to close, and I thank you so much, Arlan, for being on Bloom While You're Planted podcast, and it's sponsored by Never Too Late Cafe. And again, thank you, and it's been wonderful having you a guest.
Thank you, Laura. Fun to be here.
All right. Bye-bye now.